The government is confident its reform of the Resource Management Act will speed up the planning process and cut costs. To discuss that, I'm joined by Buddle Findlay partner, David Allen. Is it going to simplify the process?
It's going to change the process, and by changing it, it may simplify it in parts, but a lot of that still needs to be seen. The proof will be in the pudding. But very much the intentions to achieve that, but this is an incredibly complex area, and to achieve simplification is very hard bar to set.
Yeah, well, we've been talking earlier. This planning is incredibly complicated. And is it possible, some critics who seem to want to have a process where you could just turn up and have it rubber stamped that day and everything. Is that possible?
It's a utopian dream. I'm not sure of any system that's managed to achieve that in a sustainable and enduring manner. So there has to be compromises from both viewpoints to reach a reasonable outcome. There is no perfection.
One of the changes that the Minister talks about is, in terms of the environmental impacts, is to shift from looking at effects to looking at outcomes. But then I think some of the critics argue, though, that the outcomes aren't being ranked at all. So there'll be some confusion about what do you take account of? Is that an issue?
It's a fair issue to raise. The government's position is there is no priority. The Minister will set through the National Planning Framework the first go at priorities, then regional planning committees will have another go underneath that. So the idea is they'll be ranked, but they're not ranked or prioritised within the legislation itself. So some might say, for example, climate change should be a priority. It may be, but it isn't within the legislation.
You mentioned the National Planning Framework, and how much of a difference will that make? Because, if I'm a developer, say, and I'm operating all over the country and you're going to different councils, all with different rules, which makes it pretty difficult. From now on, or once this is fully into effect, will it be easier for that developer wherever they go that they're going to know that there's a relatively consistent set of principles around?
It will be easier on base requirements, like there should hopefully be standardised consent conditions for noise or for vibration or for certain specific matters. But it won't potentially be any easier on the specific matters for each development because the National Planning Framework can't go into that level of detail. So there will be some simplification, or hopefully there will be, but equally it can't achieve a totally consistent national outcome in all circumstances for a particular activity. Again, given the nuances and the complexities.
What would you identify as the main benefits from the change?
Well, the main benefits from an outcome focus are trying to look at outcomes rather than specific minutiae of individual effects. That's a change, and it is hopefully going to be a good change. The key outcome, though, is that this is a centralisation of functions, primarily to the Minister. So one of the issues with the Resource Management Act has been the lack of national provision and the lack of national direction and guidance. It's absolutely fundamental, if the new bill is to work, that there is that national guidance. If it's not there, then we're just back to where we are at present. So a key concern for me is just ensuring that that national planning framework delivers.
Yeah, so that will then depend on not just on the fact that there is national guidance, but just on how good that guidance is.
Correct. And then on the parties who implement it as well. So there's a culture change from central government all the way to decision makers, all the way to developers and councils in the middle.
Actually, the Minister commented that the real culture change needed to happen within the planning departments of councils. Is that a view that you would share?
It is one of them. It is not the real one. It's politics, and to my mind, the Minister and the government and everyone in the process must change their view and apply far more critical thinking and practical, pragmatic thinking to what they do. It's by no means council planning departments. That's plain politics.
So you've talked about the benefits. Are there costs involved in this?
Well, there's definitely costs. This is a fundamental change to a system, so there's definitely costs. There's a question there about those costs and uncertainties given the current climate we're in, where inflation's going up, where there's a housing crisis, a climate crisis, a biodiversity crisis, etc., etc. So there's a lot of things there. There's a lot of other reform going on at the same time. So there will be costs in embedding what is a significant amount of new legislation. Hopefully in the longer term, if these processes work as planned, there will be cost savings. But there's also new provisions in here that will put extra costs in. So how it balanced long term, I'm waiting to see.
How much case law are we likely to need around this to actually give us a firm idea of how it works? I mean, do you expect that there'll be quite a lot of litigation initially?
I'm hopeful the National Planning Framework will be directive and will be clear and will be simple and will focus things. If not, then yes, there will be a lot of litigation. There's a lot of new terms in here, a lot of new provisions, and a lot of new requirements with a whole new purpose. So there'll definitely be a considerable amount of legal interpretation to be applied and decided through the courts.
The opposition parties have expressed concerns about the legislation and effectively signalled that if there's a change of government, they'll scrap what's being done. I mean, how difficult is that going to be if you end up getting a seesawing between?
Well, it's a continuation of the status quo. The Resource Management Act is one of the most reformed acts. Most years there'll be a change to it, and it gets longer and longer and longer with every change. My hope had been that there would be some compromise and some consensus around it. Maybe there's definitely consensus that the RMA needs to be replaced.
Yeah, everyone agrees on that.
From there, it sort of starts to unravel. It's one of the requirements for the new regional planning committees is to try for consensus decision making, and it would be good if actually our national level politicians could try for that as well.
And I mean, you made the point about how often the RMA has been changed. I mean, how difficult has that made it for practitioners if you are getting changes to the legislation year on year on year?
Oh, it's very difficult, and it's another reason why it's not councils to blame. Council planning departments implement what they're given by the politicians. And if it changes all the time, then they're constantly renewing, refreshing, changing, and they're not being resourced nationally to do that. So it is incredibly hard, not just for practitioners, it's hard for developers, and it's hard for the council staff as well.
The government estimates that it could, for medium-sized projects, cut the compliance cost or planning cost by 19%, save about $149 million a year. Do you see that sort of cost saving or potential cost saving in the legislation?
There's the potential for cost saving. At that level, I will wait and see because that is a significant level, and I'm not sure ultimately the changes will be that significant. If the changes aren't that significant, or even if they are, there are other added costs that are new costs that will come in as well. So we'll have to wait and see. The key thing is the planning framework becomes very important. If the planning framework works, then there will be consent cost savings. But there's that if.